Well, it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about today, that every organization should have a what and a why and a where do I fit in. And you know this, you've read the same studies I have. People will give up income in order to work somewhere where they feel like there's a sense of purpose and where they feel like they're valued and they're not just a cog in a wheel.
This is the Business of Advice podcast, where we help good advisors become great business owners.
Well, this is a cool opportunity for me and an honor to have Andy Stanley here. Andy just walked off stage at our leadership summit that we host our top advisors. And as I said before you came up, you've been probably more influential in my own leadership development over the past, 15 or 16 years than anyone else. So just
that
prolific.
Just makes me feel old, 15 or 16 years.
Well, it goes by fast, doesn't it?
So it does.
Andy probably doesn't need an introduction, but a prolific pastor, author. Your leadership podcast has been just a huge resource for, I know, me and so many of our advisors too. So appreciate you taking the time to be here.
It was fun.
So I'm going to jump in with maybe a first question, but you're one of the key, I think it's fair to say, spiritual leaders in our nation, great pastor, author, but you've also built this amazing following around leadership. And what was it that made you focus so heavily on leadership at such an early point?
Well, I don't know exactly where this came from, but I worked in 2 or 3 churches and before graduate school, during graduate school, and I just felt like the local church should be so well led that the marketplace would look at what's happening within the local church organizationally and come learn. Because in any organization where you have high trust and high character and people who are where they need to be in terms of giftedness, then great things happen. Well, the church, we have all the advantages. We have a 2,000-year-old product, right, that we can't improve on. We should be people of extraordinary character who have a passion and a calling. So in terms of creating organizational structure and compatibility with gift sets, I just felt like the church should be so intuitively good at that again, we would be a model for marketplace leaders. And I had a passion too. I tell our staff, I say, I want this to be the best job, not best ministry job. I want this to be the best job you've ever had and that you will ever have, the Monday through Friday part. And so that was just a passion early on, just because I felt like the church should be well led, not just well preached.
Have you seen with that, I wasn't going to ask this question, but as you have approached it this way, have you seen your emphasis on leadership allow you to maybe reach people who wouldn't have maybe been open to hearing the message of the gospel?
Yeah, well, because, when you walk in a facility, what I say to our staff and volunteers, hey, the sermon begins in the parking lot, doesn't begin with me. So everything about the facility, everything about the organization, neatness, everything you see gives a message, messiness or clutter versus, organization, people in the parking lots, so all of that is for any organization, says something about the organization and the product that they're selling or the service they're offering. So that it has, I hear that all the time. People say, hey, I don't agree with everything you say necessarily, but I love this place. There's something about this place. There's one guy walked out one day. I didn't know him at the time. I learned later he was owned several medical companies, and he seemed kind of mad. We were walking out of 2 different doors, and he looked at me. He said, Andy. He put his thumb over his shoulder. He said, your people execute. They just execute. And he just walked off. And I thought, I think that was a compliment. And then I met him later, and I brought this up. He didn't think I would remember that, quick encounter. And he said, yeah. He said, I walk away thinking, okay, this is a volunteer-run organization, and this group executes better than the people I'm paying. And it just was and I thought, well, good. It should.
Another follow-up question to that, actually, just kind of spurred because I've heard you talk about this before. You do get, or your organization gets, a lot of volunteers to do an exceptional job. Any advice on, as people listen to this that own their own business, how do they get their team to buy in at that same level?
Well, it goes back a little bit to what we were talking about today, that every organization should have a what and a why and a where do I fit in. And you know this, you've read the same studies I have. People will give up income in order to work somewhere where they feel like there's a sense of purpose and where they feel like they're valued and they're not just a cog in a wheel and it's, hey, if it didn't work out for you, we'll get somebody else. At the end of the day, we all want to be loved. We all want to be accepted. We want to have a best friend at work. We want somebody to notice what we're doing and value what we're doing, reward what we're doing, whether it's just recognition. So all of those simple, oftentimes intangible things are what create the culture of an organization. And, I tell leaders all the time, healthy people are attracted to and stick to healthy cultures. Unhealthy people are not comfortable in a healthy culture. So if you want healthy people, which are productive people, hey, culture is how you get them and how you keep them. And I have seen, through the years, every once in a while we'll make kind of a bad hire, and they just don't last long not because they're not necessarily capable in terms of the job we hired them to do, but they kind of bounce off the culture, and oftentimes there's just some unhealth that they brought with them. But a dysfunctional culture attracts and keeps dysfunctional people. It's just, it's somewhat of a principle.
That's great. As you've started North Point and now over 25 years, it's grown just exponentially. Are there any lessons you learned about scaling up that organization along the way? Or maybe put it a different way, if there's a few things that you could go back and do different knowing what you know today, any of those that stick out?
Yeah, I really struggled when we went multi-site, and part of it was I was accustomed to being able to get everybody I was leading in the room, which most leaders don't necessarily have that luxury, but we started small enough to where that was the case. And transitioning really mentally and emotionally to realize, okay, I'm going to lead people I'll never see and never meet through my pastoral leadership, that was that was challenging. But I realized, okay, if I'm not willing to do that, I've put a lid on the organization. And if I put a lid on the organization, there are fewer leadership opportunities, fewer hiring opportunities, fewer coaching opportunities, and fewer opportunities to raise up other leaders. So multiplication wasn't simply a growth strategy. For me, multiplication was a leadership strategy because I feel like I'm responsible to raise up other leaders.
Yeah, one of the things we heard from Rory, who spoke before you, was just identifying the bottleneck in the organization, right? And if you're not able to get past that, you become such a big bottleneck.
Yeah, and I, in the past, have definitely been the bottleneck.
Yeah.
And fortunately, one of the advantages I have is 4 of the people, the original group of us who were the original staff, we knew each other for years before we started. So there was such strong relationships, even though I was kind of the boss. I'd been a roommate, I'd been a best friend, I'd traveled with these people. So they did not take me more seriously than I should be taken, and were appropriately quick to, call me on, if I was powering up or, just felt like because I have an idea, it needs to be the idea. So I feel like I've been very fortunate to be surrounded by honest people, and hopefully I've been humble enough to keep my hands open and receive the constructive criticism.
That's good. On this idea of a bottleneck, or just for so many of the advisors that we serve and work with, they are the face of the organization, and very similar to, I think, as you've started and grown, like Andy Stanley is the face of North Point. How do you continue to build and scale that organization while you're still the face, and make sure that you're able to do the most important things? And then maybe what are those, right? Because I think there are some similarities between our advisors as they scale. A lot of them don't meet with clients anymore, right? They're the face of the organization.
Yeah, well, they figured it out.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
that's the answer.
What are the keys there?
Yeah, well, it's handing off not just tasks, but handing off responsibility, getting out of the way, celebrating, people when they do a better job than I did or that you did. And ultimately, it's a hey, check your pride at the door. I mean, if this has to be all about me, then I've put a lid on the organization. If it's about the mission of the organization, then I'm going to try to facilitate the mission rather than building my own brand. And we've both seen people in the marketplace and in nonprofits or even in the church world become brand builders rather than organizational builders. And at the end of the day, when I'm gone, I want our organization to be incredible because my brand goes away. I mean, it generally doesn't outlast us for very long. Yeah. And that's for whatever reason has been easy for me. I think it's just because part of it is I love the local church, and I may have helped start a local church, but I did not start the church. It has already been branded. It already has a point person. Doesn't have a face, but we have a point person. So it seems a little foolish to try to get out ahead of that.
One of the things I want to ask you about is self-leadership, and I asked you in there, you had this great quote of, "You'll never be a leader worth following if you don't lead yourself well." And I think whether I mean, there's been some unfortunate examples in the church recently.
Yeah.
I think I've seen business leaders where sometimes you start to believe all the great things that you
Yeah.
hear about yourself, and it leads to a downfall. So just any wisdom you would share around self-leadership?
Yeah, well, the most difficult person to be honest with is the person in the mirror, which means the most difficult person to lead well is the person in the mirror. And if we're not honest with ourselves, it's going to be difficult to lead ourselves. And the thing is, everybody listening to this or watching this has worked for or with someone who was a pretender, who powered up, who, always, they just had to be the star. And no one respects that person. Even if you work for them and are dependent on them, you don't go home with greater admiration. Humility is perhaps one of the two most powerful relational dynamics. Mutual submission, I think, might be the most powerful relational dynamic. Mutual submission meaning, regardless of where we are in the organization, I'm going to leverage what I have to serve you, and you're going to leverage what you have to serve me. And I'm going to look for a way to mutually to submit to you, not based on job description or org chart, but just based on I'm here to facilitate your success. And as the point leader in our organization, I have more opportunity because I have access to more resources to facilitate the success of more people. This is, not to get into preacher mode, this is, when Jesus and the disciples were headed to Jerusalem for his date with fate, he'll be arrested and crucified, they're following along behind arguing who gets to be number 2 and number 3 in the kingdom. They think we're going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to pull off his rabbi robe, and it's going to be a big Messiah, and they're like, who gets to be number 2 and number 3? And he sits them down and says, oh, wait, we've been over this before, so one more time. Do you want to be great? And they're like, yeah, we want to be great. That's why we're arguing. He's like, well, you know how it is with everybody else. The people who are in power lord it over those who don't have power. The people in power leverage their power and resources to gain more power and resources. And they're like, yeah, we know how it works. And then he looks at them, and he looks at me, he looks at you, and he says, not so with you. In other words, in my upside down, others first kingdom, that's not how it works. Now follow me, and he goes to Jerusalem, and he dies. And then after the resurrection, they're like, I think we get it. Yeah, he was serious. And then he makes this statement. He says, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. So this is the upside down leadership paradigm that Jesus introduced, but it works everywhere. It works in family, and it works in the marketplace. The more power and resources I have, the more responsible I am, and the more responsible for being a good steward of those, and the more responsible I am for asking the question, how can I use what is available to me to help you be successful? That's who you want to work for, right?
Yeah.
That's who you want your parents to be. That's, again, every person, religious, non-religious, when you meet that person or you see that person in action, you think, wow, there's something about that. And that's what we've been called to as leaders.
One of the question, you kind of mentioned the idea of stewarding your resources well. You have this line, and I don't even remember when I listened to it, but you said that strong cash flow is a danger when opportunities abound.
Yeah.
And that's something I think as, I'll say as entrepreneurs, like you're never lacking for opportunities.
Yeah.
Any advice that you would have around how to just be thoughtful and protect yourself when opportunities are constantly presenting themselves?
And there's strong cash flow.
Yes.
Yeah, you can chase every
You
opportunity.
can make a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, and when has that ever gone well?
Not
I
very
don't.
often.
Nothing comes to mind. I'm sure it
Yeah.
has gone well for someone. And again, the other way of thinking about it is when you think about the great organizations, especially in the last 15 years, the startups that have been like, what? It starts with an idea. It doesn't start with cash. It doesn't start with cash flow. It starts with somebody with an idea who's able to pitch the idea and raise the money. Very rarely does the organization with all the money come up with the good ideas. It may have happened, but generally it's the person or the group of people who have the idea. So when an organization is flush with cash, it's sometimes it's a wonderful luxury, right? It takes some pressure off. But generally, people don't make the best decisions. And so that takes a lot of maturity. It takes a good board. And going back to what we talked about earlier, it takes a very specific mission. What are we here to do? I mean, these are great opportunities, and we've got extra cash, but why are we here? What are we doing? And what's the win for the organization? And again, there are some enormous organizations that have so much cash flow they're able to chase good opportunities. So I'm not arguing against that, but wow, you have to be careful.
Yeah. I want to talk about one of your books. I think it used to be called The Greatest Question Ever. And
The Best Question Ever?
Yeah,
Yeah.
The Best Question Ever.
Yeah.
Now it's Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. But one of the things that you
Actually, those are two different books.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, The Best Question Ever, they did change the name of
That's
that.
right.
Yeah,
That's
called Ask It.
That's the one we send out.
Yeah, the Ask
will
It.
you just, because that is the question that I've just used over and over again, and what you say is most of us get in trouble by telling ourselves like, oh, it's not the wrong thing, right?
Yeah.
And so we kind of get up to this line, and then we've gone so far that we end up making the wrong choice. So would you just talk about what the best question to ask is?
Yeah, and so I call it The Best Question Ever, then the publisher eventually changed the title of the book to Ask It. And it's the reason they said Ask It is because it's a question. The question is this: in light of my past experience, in light of my current circumstances, in light of my future hopes and dreams, what is the wise thing for me to do? Not the right thing, but what is the wise thing for me to do? And the wisdom question creates guardrails, and the wisdom question creates margin for error. What is the right thing to do, or is it the wrong thing to do, just baits me right up to the edge of disaster, right? And without any margin. So whether it's moral, financial, relational, whatever it might be, the question is, hey, what is the wise thing for me to do? And the brilliance of the question, I certainly didn't originate it, is that what is unwise for you may not be unwise for me. And what is unwise for me in this season may not be unwise for me the next season. So that's why you ask it with 3 dimensions. In light of my past experience, in light of my current circumstances, hey, is it okay for me to date? Well, no, you just got divorced 6 months ago. I think you need to take a year. So I should never date? No, I didn't say never date. In light of your current circumstances, this is a constant conversation with people who've come out of one relationship, they're ready for another. It's like, hey, I'm not against a future relationship, but in light of your current circumstances, your past experience, what is the why, not the right thing, what is the wise thing for you to do? And then in light of my future hopes and dreams, when I think about where I want my family to be, where I want to be financially, then what is the wise thing for me to do now? So the wisdom question, and the problem with the question is we usually know the answer before we finish asking the question, right? It's so clarifying that it's terrifying at times, and it's why sometimes people don't ask the question.
So in Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, one of the things that stood out, and
I talk about that question in that book as well. So.
You also talk about how your dad would never answer questions for you, and he would always kind of turn it back on you, and that just really helped in the decision-making process. Any lessons to learn from that, as far as maybe even how we train our kids and making decisions?
He would drive me crazy. He would say, well, what would you do? I would ask him to help me. What would you do if I wasn't here? I'm like, well, you are here. He's like, yeah. Or I'd ask him a question, and he would just throw it back on me. And he was teaching me how to make decisions. Because if he makes all the decisions for me, what do I learn? Nothing. And it really would frustrate. It would just drive me crazy. And then I did the same thing with my kids, and explain to them, hey, the decision you're making isn't. You don't say it's not monumental, but as a parent, you realize, okay, this isn't life or death. So I want to push this back on you so you can learn to make decisions. And that's exactly what he did. And, ultimately, I benefited from it.
Well, I think seeing it in as you raise your kids, but the reason I think it's such an important thing, something that I've tried to do even as a leader, is it's so easy for us as leaders sometimes to answer the question for our team versus putting that back on them and just really challenging them to be able to learn to make better decisions.
This is a really important leadership principle is, as the leader, I should be making as few decisions as possible. And one of the emails that people that report to me get all the time is, you decide. It's just 2 words, you decide. They'll what about? And I'm like, you decide. And I have an opinion, but you know what? You're in that world, you're closer to the details, and most decisions aren't make or break, life or death. So you decide, which means I'll trust you and I'll back you up. Like, you decide. But the temptation is, since I'm the boss, everything needs to come through me. And obviously there are some decisions, but they should be pretty rare. And the better people we hire around us and the more we empower them, ultimately, the fewer decisions we should be making. The goal in leadership isn't to make all the decisions, it's to ensure that the best decisions are made and the decisions that are made are the right decisions. Which means, for me, there are decision-making environments I should stay completely out of because I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And I'm responsible for the outcome, but I'm not smart enough to enter into that particular realm to make that decision. And that's an important differentiation for leaders.
You said something there triggered. I was telling you I was at that John Maxwell event a few weeks ago, and he had Governor Haslam, the former governor of Tennessee, there,
wow.
and he said something. He said, as governor, my goal was to make sure we got the right answer. But what he said was really, really good, and I'm just going to ask it to you. He said, what I learned over time is that when I weighed in, everyone else stopped. The conversation stopped because he's like, whether we want to admit it or not, they don't want to upset the leader. Have you seen that? And is there a way that you make sure you protect that your team doesn't
That's a great question.
stop because you weighed in?
Here's what I do. I actually say, what I'm about to say is an opinion. It is not a decision. I just say it out loud to just kind of, okay. Because,
That's good.
and it depends on who I'm with. If I'm with people that I work with closely all the time, there can be back and forth banter, and they're not so uptight. But if I'm with a different group, and because my words, as my assistant would say, she'd say, hey, your words weigh 500 pounds. In fact, there have been personnel decisions, or, we'd have to give somebody, it's not so good news, not letting somebody go, but just, and my assistant, Diane, will say, let me tell her, let me tell him. And then she'll say, my words only weigh 100 pounds.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say the same thing you would say, but it just weighs a little less coming from me. So in meetings where I feel like, okay, I have to say something or I want to weigh in, but I don't want them to I don't want my words to weigh more than they should. I'll just say, okay, this is just my opinion. This is just a thought. I'm not making a decision because that can happen.
That's good.
And the other thing I tell our staff is, don't let me catch you wearing a WWAD bracelet. What would Andy do? I do not want you to sit around going, what would Andy want us to do? That if I catch you doing that, I will not be happy. We need to do the best thing and the right thing. And if you make a mistake in an effort to do the right thing, you're not going to be penalized. But if I catch you trying to figure out what I would want you to do, that doesn't advance the organization. That doesn't really advance anything. But sometimes as leaders, we need to say those things because it's permission giving and it takes pressure off of people so they're not trying to figure out, what would Andy do? Because again, in so many arenas, because our organization has grown, I have no business weighing in on certain decisions.
That's great. I'm glad I asked that question. Okay, I know we got to get you on the road, so are you good for just a couple quick lightning round questions? I've asked everyone I've had on these questions, and the first one is, with everything that we've gone through over the past, that's called 2 years now-ish, approaching 2 years now, is there one lesson that you've taken away over this kind of last stretch that you think you will carry forward with you for the rest of your life?
Yeah, I have been extraordinarily disappointed. Or I've been surprised, I guess, at how quickly people's trust evaporates. For government, for each other, for science, for the church. It's just amazing that the people who've been in doing certain things, I'm thinking specifically in our organization, people who volunteered for years, raised their kids, and with all the disruption around political, race, COVID, it's like their trust just evaporated overnight. And that has shocked me.
Yeah.
I maybe I'm naive, but that's been shocking and disappointing.
Yeah, I heard.
So I didn't learn anything. I just observed something.
Yeah, but it is an observation of thinking about. I think I heard John Maxwell say this. When some of these people were asking him to comment on some of these things, and he's like, "My comment is how I've lived my life for the last 75 years." And he goes, "I'm not going to get caught up in your emotional immaturity around these situations. I'm going to continue to do what I know to be the most valuable thing that I can do."
Yeah, I
thought
haven't
was great.
changed.
Yeah,
that's. They were talking to a family the other day. They're going to leave. They were so upset, and they're not upset over something I've said. In the old days, it was something I said. Now they're upset because of things I won't say, which it's a pretty high bar, right?
Yeah.
You didn't say what I wanted you to say. I'm out. I'm like, well, you need to send me a list. I didn't know, but it was a friendly conversation. And I finally said, you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of the old couple driving down the road, and she's over by her door, and he's driving, and she's looking out the window, and they pull up beside this convertible, and there's this young couple, and she's kind of draped all over, the guy, and the wife says, honey, remember when we were like that? And her husband says, well, I'm not the one that moved, right? I mean, I'm still, I said, that's how
driving.
I feel. To John's point, I've been doing and saying what I've been doing and saying for years, right or wrong, but suddenly it feels like I moved. And that's human nature, and we'll get past it. But it was a little shocking and disappointing.
It has been. What is the one thing that you've done to graduate from being very good at what you do to great at what you do?
Doing less. Yeah, deciding, okay, I will, my fully exploited strengths will always be a greater value add than my marginally improved weaknesses. And you can always marginally improve a weakness, but it's never going to be a strength. So when I quit many years ago, and this was a leadership lesson it took me too long to learn. When I quit trying to get better at things that I would only be marginally good at, and took that energy and just gave it up and focused that energy on becoming better at the thing that I, in my gift set, am best at, not compared to other people, just my value add.
Yeah.
I got better at what I'm good at, and all this other stuff got taken care of and better because people who were better than me, they had room to do it.
Yeah.
And so again, it kind of is retreating back to only do what only you can do, and the more consistent I am there, the stronger. What happens is the organization then reflects my strengths. It won't reflect my weaknesses because I just stay out or try to stay out of that space. So the joke kind of in our organization is every once in a while, not much anymore because I've learned my lesson, I will think I'm doing people a favor by saying, oh, let me do that. I'm thinking, oh, I don't want you to have to do that. I'm going to do that. And they get this look of horror like, oh no. And I know what they're thinking. If you do it, it will not go well. We'll just have to fix it. And I realize the worst thing I can do is do you the favor of trying to do something you're better at to begin with. So, but every once in a while, my assistant's like, Andy, I think you should let them handle it. I'm like, you're right. I'm trying to be nice, but I'm just going to make it worse.
That's great. Is there something you're doing around your own personal growth that you're excited about right now?
I'm writing more. I learn when I write. Years and years ago, I had a counselor, and we were talking about different ways people learn, and I discovered that this is a way that I learn by writing. So I have a little idea I think I'll write about, and next thing I know, it's bigger and bigger. So we're empty nesters now. We're foster parents. We don't have kids with us right now. And so I have more time, so I'm writing more. And I feel like I'm learning more because I have the margin to write, and I learn when I write.
That's cool. What is so I always preface this, it can't be one of your books, although everyone should read all of your books, but is there one book that you have recommended the most to other business leaders, entrepreneurs?
Wow. The most in terms of a business book or a management book?
Yeah, or maybe leadership, some focused on leadership.
The book that made the biggest difference in my life, so consequently I've recommended it the most, but it was also the first leadership book I ever read. So you have to factor that in, was the Leadership Challenge. I think it came out in the late 80s. But it had but I'd never read a book on leadership, so keep that in mind. But that first cut was a deep one in terms of, oh my goodness, I didn't know anyone even wrote on the topic of leadership. I just was not in that space at all. It's still being published, the Leadership Challenge. It's an extraordinary book, and it's just almost like a manual because it's a research-based book, like Jim Collins' books are research-based books, and those I find to be the most helpful.
Well, you and John Maxwell both recommended that book, so that's a pretty good. That's a pretty good endorsement when Andy Stanley and John Maxwell recommend the same book.
It's very foundational, and again, it's very research based, and I've read so many books since then that I feel like, oh, it sounds a little bit like, and not that they're plagiarizing, but they're just some fundamental principles, that are going to surface over and over, and every generation needs new voices to talk about those things. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, final question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Wow. I think it was the only do what only you can do. In terms of leadership advice, Andy, just, again, as I extrapolated that out there's things I just need to leave alone because I'll never be good at them. Again, my fully exploited strengths or my fully developed strengths are always going to be the value add to organization, not my marginally improved weaknesses. And when I finally got that straight, I hired better people because there was more room for better people, and the organization benefited from that.
That's great. How can people stay connected with you, follow you online?
for leaders, listen to our leadership podcast,
Yeah.
and I've just got to interview some extraordinary people. So sometimes it's me sharing, with a host, and then oftentimes I'm doing the interviewing and having conversations with great people, as I mentioned in our conversation earlier. So really, I would just connect with the Leadership Podcast. Yep. And from the Leadership Podcast, we talk about the websites and, the resources that we've created and the conversation guides and all that stuff. So it's a good place to start.
They should listen to it.
It's called the Andy Stanley Leadership Podcast. I did not title it. They insisted I had to have my name in it. I'm like, that seems so creepy. They're like, well, you got to put your name in.
Yeah,
So.
well, it's easy to find that way.
Yeah.
So, Andy, I appreciate you. It's been an honor to have you here. As I said, I've wanted to have you in one of our events for a long time, so I'm honored that you would take the time to come do it.
And thanks for doing it in Atlanta.
Thank you.